Thanks for being here, everybody. My name is Devan Monette. I work at Food Connects in Brattleboro, Vermont, and I oversee Vermont Harvest of the Month program. If you're unfamiliar, Harvest of the Month is a program designed to celebrate local seasonal foods, bringing these foods into our classrooms, our cafeterias, and our communities, with the intention of planting the seeds for healthier choices in our families and our food systems. I just want to start by recognizing some of my sources. I got a lot of great information from A Regional Approach to Food System Resilience by New England Feeding New England. Highly recommend taking a look at this executive summary, and it's easily found online, and I'll provide the links afterward. And the second one, Instituting Change, an overview of institutional food procurement and recommendations for improvement. This is a report by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, and the report was done by Claire Fitch and Rachel Santo. So let me start by addressing our title. Why local? Why now? Well, first we got to kind of address what do we mean by local? There's a lot of different terms or distances put to local. And local can mean a lot of things. It can mean stepping into a school garden to pull a ripe cucumber off the vine. It could mean shopping at your neighborhood farmer's market. Or it could mean seeing New England grown apples stocked on grocery shelves for the entirety of the year. And when we think about local in terms of how the USDA defines it, though, the USDA defines local as within 400 miles. And on this map, we can see 400 miles kind of is the span of New England. This map kind of maps up the agricultural land within New England, with the pink being cultivated cropland, purple indicating pasture and hay fields, and then the green is land and easement, meaning that it's under a legal obligation to remain in agriculture and can't be developed further. So going off of the USDA definition for local, right, 400 miles. And this, spans New England as a considerable distance. But when we look at a lot of the food that we eat, the average meal travels closer to 1,500 miles from the farm to the plate. And that includes direct-to-consumer sales and intermediated sales. But that's a lot farther than what we're used to with think of local. So when we are kind of mapping out where our food comes from, there's a term known as food miles. And many people attribute this to why local food is better. Less distance traveled means less greenhouse gas emissions, and this makes sense. However, if we look closely at it, it's a lot more complicated than that. This is because a lot of the negative impacts of our agricultural system are created outside of transport alone. In fact, 83% of greenhouse gas emissions actually come from the food production, not from transporting it. And not all transport is created equal. If we look at kind of this graph in the bottom left here, cargo ships are highly efficient in moving shelf-stable food. But if we think of food being flown around on a plane in climate-controlled refrigeration units, then the food mile starts to add up and can be a considerable factor in the waste created, the pollution offset by that food. But if we're to go to the root of the problem, again, it's not necessarily where our food is grown, but how. We will still return to why local is important at the end of our presentation, but for now, let's focus at some of the problems that exist in our failing food system. To answer this question, we must first take a better look at understanding kind of the size of typical farm in the US. So looking at this graph, we can see this line in orange here. This represents the land in the acreage of land in farms, which has more or less remained consistent from 1850 to current day. But where we see the changes are in the number of farms and average farm size. So this green line indicates the number of farms, which in the middle of the century took a drastic dip. And with that, we see that the average farm size increased dramatically, kind of has stayed the same until current times. This is a direct result of corporate agriculture. If we look at this graphic from the Pew Charitable Trust, kind of indicates some of the severe overtaking by just a few corporations, in particular with the livestock production. So, right from 1980 to 2010, you can see a huge uptick in just a small number of corporations owning huge shares of beef, pork, and poultry production. And this is a problem for a number of reasons. In addition, that kind of monopolization of the food system carries through all the way into food service providers. In this graphic from the Johns Hopkins report, we can see that just three food service providers own about 45% of the food service industry. And with big corporations, a lot of the problem lies in profit being the bottom line, which results in increase in pollutions, erosion, increased need for synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and not to mention the decrease in working conditions, decrease in workers' rights, and the side effects of massive factory farms in rural, often impoverished communities. The vast majority of food animals in the US are raised in confined operations, often indoors, with little to no access to pasture. And in fact, nearly half of all food animals are raised on the larger scale facilities, which occupy less than 5% of the land used for animal agriculture. If we take Wisconsin, for example, often thought of as one of the hubs for dairy production in the United States. In 1997, we saw that farms with 500 or more cows held just 3% of the state's dairy herd. By 2017, that number had jumped to 41%. So the number of farms is decreasing, and the size of those farms is increasing significantly. These are just some pictures of industrial dairy operations. This one is in Wisconsin. You can see just, massive barns overhead where the cows have little to no access to pasture, and just kind of creates a real high concentration of manure and has a lot of problems in the environment. The shift from having more diverse, smaller and mid-sized farms to less larger farms has created a huge imbalance in the power and control over our food supply. And it raises big questions about environmental justice, animal welfare, the stability of rural economies, and what kind of food system we want to be a part of. Here's just another example showing a lot of the kind of sub companies that are owned by larger meat brands, Tyson Foods, JBS, National Beef, Cargill, owning lots of different companies, creating kind of an illusion of options in the grocery store, when in reality, just a few corporations own a lot of the farms that are producing our food. So, let's get into kind of some of the ways that these large-scale industrial farms are hurting our planet and our people, starting with how they impact the land, how our land is exploited. So when we look at the health of our soil, right, a lot of the nutrients and the quality of our agricultural lands is uh, exists in the topsoil, right, the top layer that has the organic material needed to grow healthy plants. And topsoil is disappearing faster than it can regenerate. We have, uh, without, with monocropping and without crop rotation, without the ability to uh, rest the soil and give it time to recuperate, we have increases in erosion that washes out soil and creates pollution in our waterways and is stripping the land of the vital nutrients it needs to grow plants. Um, in addition, in industrial farms, we see that there is a huge lack of biodiversity by having these massive monocultures grown in huge expanses. We have a loss of the butterflies and the bees and the natural pollinators that create diversity in the ecosystem that surrounds these farms and kind of create a natural buffer for um, things like harmful, the pests that eat our crops and the pathogens that can be problematic when we have a natural ecosystem working in tandem with our agriculture. There is a little bit of a buffer that protects that land. In these large scale industrial farms, that biodiversity is lost, and this increases the need for pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. Uh, Here's just an example of what biodiversity looks like, having lots of different plants kind of growing within versus monocrop, one plant growing over a large area. Coming back to some of the fertilizers, right? So in small scale gardens, right, organic fertilizers like manure can be used to increase the organic matter and feed the soil that feeds our plants. But when growing on such a large scale and growing for maximum efficiency, synthetic fertilizers are used, uh, derived from petroleum that can feed the plant faster, but don't necessarily feed the soil or contribute to the health of the land. So these can cause they often don't all get utilized by the plant, and there's a lot of runoff with these synthetic fertilizers, and this can create algae blooms. This is at the Gulf of Mexico. This is Louisiana right here in the delta of the Mississippi River, kind of a channel from the breadbasket of America, right, where a lot of monocultures are grown in the Midwest. And the synthetic fertilizers run down into the Mississippi, into the Gulf of Mexico. And these areas in red are highlighting areas that have had large algae blooms. And an algae bloom is when um, algae just grows in rapid succession and chokes the water, takes the oxygen out of the water, and it kills a lot of fish. Um, and it doesn't stop there, right? We have really high demands for water in crops like corn, which stresses limited water sources. It takes water away from communities and ecosystems in the immediate area. In addition to exploiting the land, the people that work in these industries are also exploited. Um, in the US, immigrants make up a significant portion of the agricultural workforce. About 70% of farm workers are immigrants, and roughly 40% of them are undocumented. Because of their vulnerable legal status, these workers are often underpaid, provided with inadequate housing, and routinely subjected to mistreatment and unsafe working conditions. In general, all farm workers are routinely exposed to dangerous conditions. It's a hazardous job, but when the scale of the farm is increased and there's higher need for pesticide and fertilizer applications, the risk of on-the-job accidents and long long-term health impacts increase significantly. Things like respiratory illness, cancers, reproductive issues, skin conditions can result due to exposure to pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and other agrochemicals. And like I said, these hazards are only multiplied with the size of the farms. And the other angle of this is that the communities that are living in proximity to these farms often have adverse effects in their water quality, in the pollution, and kind of the um, accidental spray of pesticides drifting off crops and things like that, and create a lot of problems for communities that are often disproportionately low income and communities of color, and in the least power to kind of address this injustice. So a lot of harm falls on the people that live in close proximity to these industrial farms. But if we were to look closely, perhaps some of the greatest costs can fall on us as the consumer. If we're looking closely at the food and how it's kind of evolved over the century, right, there's this increase in synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and antibiotics that are necessary to keep up with the demands of the market and to kind of make the land and the animals work when the natural production value of those crops has kind of been maxed out. And this can result in bacterial pathogens, heavy metals, and dioxins in our food. And not to mention, right, the complexity of our food system has increased the processing of our food. See, like on our left, right, whole foods, corn, potatoes, whole wheat, all that, with more hands in the food system manipulating the food and taking it to value-added products unnecessarily. We see our food lowering in its nutritional content, and it has a lot of synthetic additives that can cause significant health problems. We've seen uptick in diet-related diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and many more. And not to mention just the incredible amount of food waste. Every single year, right, up to 40% of the food in the US is wasted. And in general, this is just a huge symbol of the manipulation and the disrespect for the plants and animals that nourish us, treating them more like commodities rather than the living systems that they are. So, how can we address the problem? How can Harvest of the Month be positioned to help us rethink our food systems? Well, first, I want us to just take an opportunity to think about what a food system is. So I invite you now to pause the video in class or with your group if you would like to just kind of brainstorm what are some of the different components that make up a food system at its most basic level. And then we'll resume in a second and see what we arrived at. So if we think about food system, right, and its most basic, it starts with inputs, seeds, nutrients, labor, and equipment. From there, the food is grown, right? Our livestock and crop farmers are producing the food, and then it is distributed processed, traded, and kind of goes down the line to wholesalers and food manufacturers, and then finally arriving right groceries, restaurants, food service, and brought to the consumer. But with time and with more hands in the system, we've seen some complexities added. Animal pharmaceuticals, right? Creating antibiotics and drugs to keep animals healthy enough to be harvested, um, genetically modified organisms, and engineering uh, crops to be more efficient and produce more food. Agrochemicals, including pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. Um, and then there's lots of other layers, right? So we have uh, investors and financial institutions to distribute loans and finance multiple aspects of this. We have tech software to make things more efficient, to run programs that coordinate a lot of this. Third-party certifications to help ensure that our food is grown responsibly or as the certification says it is. The multiple layers of distribution from cargo ships, planes, trucking, planes, um, and included with that, right, are some of the cold chain providers. That means, right, a cold chain distribution is thinking of the perishable items that need to be distributed while under refrigeration. The marketing to sell foods and to make it appealing and create labels and things like that. Retail brokers, food management companies that are helping to oversee and to uh, sell foods through institutions and coordinate that. Packaging and labeling, food additives and synthetic stabilizers to make our food more shelf stable, and labor contractors. So, right, lots of different aspects into the food system, and still we have lots of waste, right? That comes out at every different aspect of it. So, right, with all these different components, we see that at some point in the evolution of our food system, food became big business. And when corporations jumped in, they didn't just streamline the system, they began buying up multiple components of the food system. They inserted layers of processing, branding, marketing, and logistics, each adding costs, environmental impact, and more distance between us and our food. This drove the market to be highly competitive, with profit leading the way and the quality of our food being merely an afterthought. But let's be clear, having a thriving food system isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's room for a lot of these components when when there's diversity in who owns those and in who has a say in how they're operated. When our food system has an emphasis on regional food, and with small to mid-size companies and farms having more stock, more say in how that food is managed, we can have a healthier food system. But this will take time. And something to always keep in mind in this conversation is that not everybody can just go decide to buy local and have to change their food choices, right? Food is something that sustains us, and we don't all have equal access to it. Something that was really kind of startling in researching this is thinking through like what kind of grocery stores people have access to. And these are the top 10 grocery stores in New England. If we look at it, we see that Dollar Tree and Dollar General are significantly higher in the two top grocery stores, which I don't even think of them necessarily as a grocery store, but a lot of families buy their food here because it's cheap and affordable. But it's not necessarily going to be healthy or have any fresh produce options, let alone local options. Um, and because not everybody can afford local whole foods, the most important and uh, the most important place to emphasize this movement is in our schools, in our institutions, and this is where Harvest of the Month comes in. When we can increase the visibility of our regional farms, people that grow them, we can bring back farming into our culture, into a healthy relationship with uh, the ecosystem and with the communities that they feed. Uh, when we have more small or mid-sized farms, right, these businesses depend on their reputation. They depend on their relationships, and they need to be in good standing with their neighbors and the communities that they serve. These foods will have a higher initial cost, but it's up to schools and institutions to create a window into this alternative food system so that our students and communities begin to understand where their food comes from. So, what can we do? What steps can we take to bring Harvest of the Month to life in your classroom or in your school? There's a few things we can do at the local level, at or our community level, and then at a regional level. So to start, right, it's really important just to take time to celebrate your food. A big part of our disconnect with the food system stems from just not knowing where that food is grown, who had a hand in bringing it to our plate. Um, Harvest of the Month tries to encourage people to try new foods uh, and to celebrate foods when they're in abundance and when they're the freshest and most nutrient dense. So taking a moment around a meal or around a snack just to pay thanks and kind of understand how that food arrived at your plate and how um, all the work that went into making it. If we uh, zoom out a little bit, right, and how we understand our food, Harvest of the Month also helps by creating that story behind the food, uh, learning about its nutritional benefits, the incredible histories that shaped a particular food into existence. They can all be ways to understand your food in a deeper level and have more appreciation. So whether this is growing an ingredient in the garden or um, researching a food's origin with your class, or just reading the label when you're buying produce to understand the journey that that food made, these are all steps that we can take to better understand our food. Um, Also, critically important, especially now, is to advocate for food, advocate for farmers, and to work to understand some of the local, state, and national policies that shape our food system, to keep yourself informed as these policies shift and make sure that your voice is heard. This could be as simple as taking the time to reach out to a representative, just letting them know that you care about regional food markets. And lastly, right, thinking in kind of the most zoomed out into our regional food system and what we can do to help that. Um, Asking ourselves what foods are grown in our region. Uh, if you give me a sec here, I'll have this graphic here. This is kind of the foods of New England, and I'll come back to this in a sec. But thinking about what options are available to you, right? If blueberries are not in season year round, is there another fruit that maybe stores better or can be uh, kept fresh and available to your family so that you don't have to buy foods that have to travel long distances with high greenhouse gas emissions. And in particular, right, thinking about some of the foods that have the highest uh, negative impact on our environment, meat and proteins are uh, the biggest culprits. So just trying to shift our diets to be more sustainable and more resilient is really some of the things the small steps we can take to make a really big impact. Um, Lastly, I say just, yeah, finding ways to buy foods in bulk and to process foods yourself so that you can get them at their most affordable rate, and learning how foods are best stored so that your pantry can kind of help store that food for longer and offset some of the cost of buying higher quality foods. So yes, coming back to this, right? This is just kind of a visual map of what farms are prevalent in New England. We see, right, a lot of the land is tied up in hay production and pasture lands, um, and that, you know, poultry, eggs, cattle, nursery, greenhouse, berries. So these are the farms, right, and just kind of the acreage that's devoted to each of these niches of agriculture. If we look at sales, it's a little different. Sales, right? Milk is the top uh, industry in New England, followed by vegetables and nursery greenhouses, and then we get into some of the smaller, more uh, niche products. But in general, just familiarizing ourselves with what foods are available, when they're available, and the harvest of the month calendar can be a really helpful tool in starting that conversation. So, returning back to our title, right? We have why local, why now, um, why harvest of the month. This is a program designed to ingrain appreciation and knowledge and to instill a higher value in the quality of whole foods. Um, when we invest in quality over quantity, we can build momentum in a regional food system to create a more sustainable food system for the future, to nourish our bodies, to feed growing communities, and to create hope in the face of climate change. When you are able to support regionally grown foods, you're supporting real people, local jobs, and in general, you're building a more resilient system for the future. So I want to thank you all for watching and tuning in. Special thank you to Shelburne Farms and Farmer School and Early Childhood Vision Grant for supporting this work and bringing this to life. Thanks so much.